Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Complexities of Discourse in Discourse Analysis. Discourse analysis delves into the intricate ways language constructs social realities, reflects power relations, and shapes meaning in various contexts. Discourse itself is not a straightforward phenomenon. It involves multiple layers of complexity, including the interaction between language, power, culture, identity, and ideology. Understanding these complexities is essential to uncovering how discourse functions beyond mere communication, as it operates within broader social and historical contexts. 1. Multifaceted nature of discourse. Discourse is not limited to a single dimension. It encompasses various forms of spoken, written, visual, and multimodal communication. Analyzing discourse means examining not only what is being said but also how, why, and under what conditions language is being used. The complexities arise from the social, cultural, and political layers embedded within discourse, making it a site for the negotiation of meaning and power. Text and context interplay. One of the key complexities in discourse analysis is the relationship between text and context. Discourse does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by and shapes the context in which it occurs. The meaning of a particular discourse can change depending on the surrounding social, cultural, and historical circumstances. Example: a simple statement like, "I'm sorry," can have vastly different meanings depending on the context. In an informal conversation between friends, it might signal regret, but in a courtroom, it could serve as an admission of guilt. Analyzing this interplay between the discourse and its context is crucial for understanding the full meaning and implications of language use. Discourse as social practice. Discourse is not only about the exchange of information but also a form of social practice. It both reflects and shapes societal structures, identities, and relationships. This dual role of discourse complicates its analysis, as it requires attention to how language both reproduces and challenges existing social norms, power relations, and ideologies. Example: in workplace discourse, language use reflects hierarchical relationships, how employees address their superiors or subordinates, and at the same time, reinforces or challenges those hierarchies. A casual conversation between a manager and a subordinate may subtly affirm the power dynamic, while a more formal or confrontational exchange could challenge it. Point 2. Power and ideology in discourse. A critical area of complexity in discourse analysis involves the examination of power and ideology. Language is a powerful tool for maintaining or subverting social hierarchies, and discourse is one of the main mechanisms through which ideologies are perpetuated or contested. Discourse analysts examine how language reflects dominant ideologies and how it can be used to challenge those ideologies. Ideological functions of language. Discourse often embeds ideological assumptions that can seem natural or taken for granted. These assumptions reflect broader societal values and beliefs, making them difficult to identify without careful analysis. One of the complexities in discourse analysis lies in uncovering these hidden ideologies and exploring how they shape people's understanding of the world. Example: media discourse about welfare recipients may use phrases like welfare dependency or abuse of benefits, which frame recipients negatively and reinforce neoliberal ideologies of self-reliance. Discourse analysts would examine how these terms position welfare policies within a broader ideological framework that emphasizes individual responsibility over collective social support. Power relations and discursive strategies. The relationship between language and power is a central concern in discourse analysis. Power is often exercised subtly through discourse, using discursive strategies such as framing, nominalization, and silencing to maintain dominance or control the narrative. These strategies complicate discourse analysis, as power relations are often embedded within everyday language practices. Example: in institutional discourse, such as in legal or medical settings, Professionals often use technical jargon that positions them as experts and reinforces their authority over non-expert participants. A discourse analyst might examine how language is used to exclude or marginalize certain voices, maintaining a power imbalance between professionals and laypeople. Point 3. Intertextuality and interdiscursivity. Another layer of complexity in discourse analysis involves intertextuality and interdiscursivity, where discourse references or draws on other texts and discourses. Understanding these connections is essential to grasp how meaning is shaped and how discourses interact with each other across different contexts. Intertextuality. Intertextuality refers to the way in which one discourse draws upon or echoes another. Discourses are rarely isolated, they are often linked to prior texts or discourses, creating a web of meanings. This makes discourse analysis more complex, as analysts must consider how texts interact with each other and how meanings are transferred or transformed across different discursive contexts. Example: a political speech might reference historical events, such as the civil rights movement, drawing on those discourses to lend credibility and emotional weight to the speaker's current message. Understanding this intertextuality is essential for analyzing the persuasive power of the speech. Interdiscursivity. Interdiscursivity involves the mixing of different discursive practices or genres within a single discourse. This blending of discourse types reflects the complexity of modern communication, where genres and social practices often overlap. Discourse analysts examine how these hybrids function, particularly in media, political, or institutional communication. Example: in advertising, interdiscursivity might occur when a commercial blends the language of self-care with that of environmental activism, positioning a product as both beneficial to the consumer and environmentally friendly. Analyzing this discourse involves unpacking the layers of meaning that come from combining these distinct discursive practices. Point 4. Multimodality in discourse. In an increasingly visual and digital age, discourse analysis must also account for multimodal communication, where meaning is constructed not only through language but also through visual, auditory, and other nonverbal elements. The combination of text, image, sound, and gesture adds further complexity to discourse analysis, requiring an understanding of how these different modes work together to produce meaning. Visual and verbal interplay. Multimodal discourse often involves the interaction between visual elements and verbal language. This interplay can create new meanings or reinforce existing ones, complicating the process of analysis. Discourse analysts need to consider how images, colors, layout, and text contribute to the overall message. Example: in political campaign posters, the image of the candidate, the colors used, and the slogan all work together to create a coherent message. A discourse analyst would study how these multimodal elements interact, potentially reinforcing a narrative of strength, unity, or progress. Multimodal framing. Multimodality also influences how issues are framed. Different modes of communication can frame the same issue in distinct ways, leading to varied interpretations. This complexity requires discourse analysts to be attuned to the subtleties of nonverbal communication and how it complements or contradicts verbal language. Example: a documentary on climate change might use dramatic music and footage of natural disasters alongside interviews with scientists. The emotional power of the music and visuals frames the issue as urgent and alarming, while the scientific discourse provides rational support. Analyzing this multimodal discourse involves looking at how these different elements shape the viewer's understanding. Point 5. Temporal and spatial dimensions of discourse. Discourse is also shaped by temporal and spatial factors, adding another layer of complexity to its analysis. Language and meaning can change over time, and discourse that is meaningful in one historical moment may carry different connotations in another. Additionally, discourse varies across different geographical and cultural spaces, complicating the analysis of global or transnational discourses. Diachronic analysis. In diachronic discourse analysis, researchers examine how discourse changes over time. This approach highlights the temporal complexity of language, as words, phrases, and entire discourses can shift in meaning depending on historical and social developments. Discourse analysts must consider these temporal dynamics when interpreting texts from different periods. Example: the discourse surrounding women's rights has evolved significantly over the last century. Early feminist texts might frame the issue in terms of legal rights and suffrage, while contemporary feminist discourse may focus on intersectionality and global gender justice. Analyzing these shifts requires understanding how historical context influences discourse. Spatial and cultural variation. Discourse also varies across different spatial and cultural contexts. What is considered appropriate or meaningful discourse in one culture may be understood differently in another. Globalization has further complicated this issue, as discourses circulate across borders, often blending local and global meanings. Example: a multinational corporation's advertising campaign might use universal discourses of success and happiness, but local variations of the same ad might draw on culturally specific symbols or language. Discourse analysts studying such campaigns must account for these cultural nuances to fully understand the campaign's impact. Point 6. Examples of complex discourse in analysis. Example 1. Media discourse on immigration. Media discourse on immigration often reflects complex intertextuality, drawing on legal, political, and humanitarian discourses simultaneously. News coverage may frame immigration as a legal issue, a social crisis, or a moral responsibility, blending different discursive practices. Analyzing this complexity involves unpacking how these frames interact and shape public perception. Example 2. Corporate multimodal communication. A company's annual report may use a combination of text, graphs, images, and slogans to present its financial success and social responsibility. This multimodal discourse blends the genres of corporate reporting, marketing, and public relations, complicating the analysis. A discourse analyst would explore how these elements work together to create a narrative of trust and success. Example 3. Political discourse in global forums. Political discourse in international forums, such as the United Nations, often involves the negotiation of meaning across different cultural and ideological frameworks. Delegates must navigate the complexities of language to appeal to a global audience while maintaining their national interests. Discourse analysis in this context requires attention to both the explicit content of speeches and the subtle, culturally specific cues that influence interpretation. Conclusion. The complexities of discourse in discourse analysis arise from the multifaceted nature of language, power, and meaning. Discourse is shaped by its context, ideological assumptions, intertextual and interdiscursive connections, multimodal elements, and temporal and spatial dimensions. Understanding these complexities allows discourse analysts to uncover the deeper layers of meaning embedded in communication and to reveal how language constructs, maintains, and challenges social realities. Whether examining media, political, or institutional discourse, analysts must navigate these complexities to provide a nuanced understanding of how discourse operates in shaping human experience. Frequently asked questions. What makes discourse complex in discourse analysis? Discourse is complex because it encompasses multiple layers of meaning, including interactions between language, power, culture, identity, and ideology. It involves various forms of communication, spoken, written, visual, and multimodal, embedded within social, cultural, and historical contexts. Discourse analysis must consider these multifaceted elements to understand how language constructs social realities and reflects power dynamics. How does the interplay between text and context add complexity to discourse analysis? Discourse does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by its context, including social, cultural, and historical factors. The meaning of a text can change depending on the surrounding context. For example, the phrase, "I'm sorry," can convey different meanings in casual conversation versus a courtroom. Discourse analysts must examine how context influences the interpretation of language to uncover its full meaning and implications. What does it mean to say discourse is a social practice? Discourse is a social practice because it both reflects and shapes societal structures, identities, and relationships. It is not just an exchange of information but a way of acting within society that can reproduce or challenge social norms, power relations, and ideologies. For instance, workplace discourse reflects hierarchical relationships while simultaneously reinforcing or contesting them through language use. How do power and ideology manifest in discourse? Power and ideology are embedded in discourse through language that either perpetuates or challenges social hierarchies and norms. Language can subtly exercise power through strategies like framing, nominalization, and silencing. For example, media discourse might use phrases like welfare dependency to frame welfare recipients negatively, reinforcing neoliberal ideologies of self-reliance. What is the role of intertextuality in discourse complexity? Intertextuality refers to the way one discourse references or draws upon other texts, creating a network of meanings. Discourse is rarely isolated, it often echoes prior texts, making analysis complex. For instance, a political speech might reference historical events to lend credibility and emotional weight to the speaker's message. Understanding these intertextual connections is crucial for analyzing the discourse's persuasive power. How does interdiscursivity contribute to discourse complexity? Interdiscursivity involves the blending of different discursive practices or genres within a single discourse. This reflects the complexity of modern communication, where genres often overlap. For example, an advertisement might combine the language of self-care with environmental activism, creating a hybrid discourse that requires analysis of the multiple layers of meaning drawn from different discursive practices. Why is multimodality significant in discourse analysis? Multimodality refers to the use of multiple modes of communication, e.g., text, image, sound, gesture, in discourse. In a visual and digital age, meaning is often constructed through a combination of verbal and nonverbal elements. For example, a political campaign poster might use images, colors, and slogans together to convey a message. Discourse analysts must consider how these multimodal elements interact to produce meaning. How do temporal and spatial dimensions influence discourse? Discourse is influenced by temporal and spatial factors, as language and meaning can change over time and vary across cultures. Diachronic analysis examines how discourse evolves historically, while spatial analysis considers how discourse varies across different geographical and cultural contexts. For instance, feminist discourse has evolved from focusing on legal rights to emphasizing intersectionality and global gender justice, reflecting historical and cultural shifts. What are some common discursive strategies used to maintain power? Discursive strategies used to maintain power include framing, nominalization, and silencing. For example, framing an issue in a particular way, e.g., war on drugs, can shape public perception and justify certain actions. Nominalization, e.g., policies were implemented, can obscure agency and responsibility. Silencing involves excluding or marginalizing certain voices, often seen in institutional settings where technical jargon positions professionals as experts. How do intertextuality and interdiscursivity differ in discourse analysis? Intertextuality refers to how one discourse references or echoes other texts, creating a web of meanings. Interdiscursivity, on the other hand, involves the blending of different discursive practices or genres within a single discourse. Intertextuality focuses on the connections between texts, while interdiscursivity examines the mixing of different types of discourse within one text. How does discourse change over time? Discourse changes over time due to shifts in social, cultural, and historical contexts. Diachronic analysis examines these changes, revealing how meanings, ideologies, and language use evolve. For example, discourse around women's rights has shifted from focusing on legal suffrage to emphasizing intersectionality and inclusivity. Understanding these temporal dynamics is key to interpreting discourse from different periods. How can discourse vary across different cultural contexts? Discourse varies across cultures, as what is considered meaningful or appropriate in one culture may be interpreted differently in another. Globalization has further complicated this by blending local and global discourses. For example, a multinational advertising campaign might use universal symbols of success but adapt local variations to resonate with specific cultural values. Discourse analysts must account for these cultural nuances to fully understand the discourse's impact. What is an example of multimodal framing in discourse? Multimodal framing involves using different modes of communication to frame an issue in specific ways. For instance, a documentary on climate change might combine dramatic music, visuals of natural disasters, and scientific interviews to frame the issue as urgent and alarming. Discourse analysis would examine how these elements work together to shape the viewer's understanding and emotional response.